and welcome to my talk today. I have the privilege of talking to you about critical infrastructure, and I am specifically going to define that to talk about industrial control systems. Let me back up here. I will do a brief introduction for you, and mostly, hopefully, to motivate you on any of you that are coming into this field, especially teens and similar, that might not be heavily into cybersecurity yet. May have not focused on it or taken any classes on it, or you're really just interested in the field. And my motivational story for you is I didn't figure it out until pretty late in my career. So I started in the U.S. Air Force Academy, and my academic supervisor said, "You should specialize in computer science. You seem to like computers." I was like, "That sounds cool." And another colonel pulled me aside and was like, "Or you could do political science and have a life." And I was like, "That sounds even better." And so I was a poli sci major at the academy, not a comp sci major, and I still barely graduated. The U.S. Air Force side of the house had fun as a cyber warfare operations officer. Long title to say that I did cybersecurity stuff. And I'm not even going to say that I was like really great there. I feel like I found my stride at the National Security Agency. I ended up building out the U.S. government's mission, looking at various states breaking into industrial sites around the world. But it wasn't really until I combined my passions together and started teaching at SANS, and also now I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Dragos. Those two things together is what's put me in this place of non-ironically saying I'm living the dream. So for all of you out there, whether you get started after presentations like this, or whether you get started 10 years from now, realize that it's never too late. And if an idiot like me can do it, so can you. So let's jump into what we're talking about. I'm sure that you have some great SANS presentations today. Hopefully some good technical content brought down to make it accessible. For me, outside of running a company and teaching, I write a comic every week, Little Bobby, with Jeff Haas. And so my entire presentation is just comic strips. That's the level of acumen and sort of expertise that I'm bringing you today. But I think that is a fun way to mix it up over Zoom in the middle of a crazy year, trying to make it accessible. So I'm going to have a comic strip per slide, and we're going to go through some key points. And here's all I need you to take away from the presentation. I'm going to dig into a lot of stuff. But the main thing I want you to take away is when we talk about critical infrastructure and whatever that word means to us. Some folks will look at it from power community. Some folks will look at it of election infrastructure. Some will look at it like I do, and that the government might define certain critical infrastructure sectors, but I'm from Coleman, Alabama. The cooperative in my hometown is critical infrastructure to my family and the people in that area. So it might be a small distribution grid. It might be a small electric cooperative. That's pretty critical to the people in that side of the world. So the way that I look at critical infrastructure is not as some category defined by the government, but as the infrastructure that's really critical for our daily lives. Lights, water, power, transportation, manufacturing, oil and gas, et cetera. And the underpinnings of critical infrastructure are not the enterprise networks. Those are awesome networks, worthy of doing fun stuff in security. But in my view of the world, some of the most critical things of the critical infrastructure are those industrial control systems. We'll call them ICS, industrial control systems, because cybersecurity is always big on acronyms. We'll talk a lot about, sometimes you'll hear the word SCADA as a specific type of ICS. It doesn't matter. The point is there's a lot of industrial control systems that power the world to keep everything running. And you will be hard pressed to find any industry that they're not present. Just as a little bit of a house rules as we go on here, by the way, feel free to throw in your questions as we go along. What I'm going to do is I'm going to roll through my presentation, and we'll stick around after the presentation to answer questions in chat, but I probably won't answer too many live. So feel free to put them in there, and I'll answer every single one of them before I leave here today. All right, so if we have our scene setting that critical infrastructure is kind of everywhere, and that industrial control systems are the critical stuff of the critical infrastructure, then we probably need to understand what industrial control systems are. So when you everything that we have in information technology, you'll have a Windows system, a Windows operating operating system in a power plant. That's okay. You have specialized controllers and equipment too, but it's everything you would expect in IT plus physics. And it's that physics piece that makes a lot of things different for us. And the reality is, as we try to protect this infrastructure, we have to kind of de-educate ourselves on a lot of the things we might have learned in enterprise cybersecurity. Now, a lot of that's transferable. A lot of it's really important. But the focus of ICS security and critical infrastructure security largely is dependent on understanding the mission and what can go wrong at that mission and how to then protect that organization from those disastrous consequences. It could be intellectual property theft. If you think about a manufacturing line creating some new cool technology, the intellectual property isn't stored in an email server somewhere, it's in the manufacturing line itself. In the terms of electric power, the ability to de-energize portions of our infrastructure, chemical plants, the ability to cause an explosion or do something unsafe or damaging to the environment. There's a mission behind all this stuff that interacts with physics. There's a physical process. And we're bound to that, as are the adversaries. We can come up with all sorts of scary, hyped up, crazy scenarios. But we're still bound by physics. I can't do things that violate the laws of physics. But if I'm going to secure them, I also need to understand what those bounds are so I can devise the right security for our environment. So think about ICS as all the stuff in IT plus physics. And yes, there are general purpose computing systems as well as purpose-built controllers. You'll talk sometimes about like PLCs or program logic controllers or RTUs and remote terminal units and all sorts of jargon. But the fundamentals is very simple. Things that can interact with the physical world around us and help change the way we interact with the physical world around us. Now, you're going to have to be very, very careful of hype if you're getting into this field of ICS security. And really, in a 30-minute presentation, all I'm trying to do is convey to you a couple key points and get you excited about ICS security. I do want you to leave here going, maybe I should look into this a little bit more. And as you look into it, you need to be very, very careful of the hype. Now, we've got a lot of good journalists out there that have spent a lot of time upping their game on this topic for sure. But it is very fair to say for years, we've had a lot of sensational articles about a phishing email getting delivered to a power company. And oh my gosh, the power grid is going to go down. Well, that's not how that works. How do you go from phishing email to power grid going down? That's a huge leap. And there's no such thing as the power grid in the United States. As an example, we have multiple electric grids. So there's a lot of hype out there. There's one or two big stories every year. Oh, there was a gas pipeline explosion. I bet it was a cyber attack. Nope, it wasn't. You know, there's always these hyped up cases because when you start realizing that our infrastructures are vulnerable to cyber attacks, then you start looking for it almost everywhere. And then you see something weird that you can't explain and you jump to the answer of, oh, maybe it was a cyber attack. Well, maybe, but it could also be a maintenance issue or a number of other things that happen more frequently. So do we need to get better at understanding the ability to detect if things are cyber attacks? Sure. But do we really need to jump to the conclusion that everything's cyber related in our field? No. And unfortunately, if you start doing research in this field, you'll find a lot of that to be the case. So be very, very skeptical, even when people have that fancy expert title next to their name. Now, the other thing to know about our industrial control system community and critical infrastructure is we have some unique challenges. One of the unique challenges is we operate in long life cycles. When I build that power generation facility, when I build that new chemical plant, when I build that new oil refinery, I'm expecting to get 10, 15, 20, likely 30 years of value out of that asset, out of that plant. And so when I think about that plant and getting value out of it for 20 or 30 year long life cycles, whatever I think about in terms of cybersecurity can't be a, hey, I'm going to bring it in this week and we're going to swap it out next year. I've got to think about strategic kind of security initiatives that are going to carry for years. Now, and it doesn't have to be 20 or 30 years, but we're talking 5 to 10 year kind of cycles would be much more appropriate. And a lot of cybersecurity can kind of be flavor of the day of things that are useful now may not be useful next year. Great examples, passwords. For a long, long time, we told people, make sure you change your passwords every 90 days. Then we looked at it and went, no, that's actually not good advice. You shouldn't change it every 90 days. Then we looked at it and said, well, instead of just having strong passwords, why not have two-factor authentication with like SMS and text messages? Then we're like, oh, wow, SMS and text messages, those are vulnerable. We should do multi-factor authentication and things like YubiKey or specific applications. And so kind of evolves quickly, as we should. We should be very flexible in cybersecurity and keep evolving as the threats evolve. But when you're trying to solve challenges at plant level, and we're thinking about those long life cycles, we have to be a little bit creative about how we solve the problem. And we need to think about, sort of what's the requirements that we're trying to solve, not necessarily just what's the technology going to be that we leverage. And all of that has to start with some level of understanding of what the problem is. And this is probably the largest problem in the ICS security community today, is that when CEOs of their companies and boards of directors went to the executives in cybersecurity, like your chief information security officer, and said, I want you to reduce risk as it relates to cyber and cyber threats. The CSOs and CSOs of many of these organizations, not undeservedly, focused on the enterprise and said, okay, let me take my budget that I have and try to reduce the risk that we're seeing with all these attacks we're seeing and all these intrusions we're seeing on the enterprise. And so they spent a lot of money on website security and application security and enterprise security, and it was rightfully spent. There was a lot of work to be done there. But what didn't happen is we didn't get a lot of investment in the industrial control system side of the house. Those networks that are actually the networks that are generating the revenue of the company, and they're the most critical components of the company. So what we found over the years is there's at times belief that there's not many attacks, or maybe there's not many attempts by adversaries to get in, or well, not a lot of things are happening there. And as we take a look at that and you ask the question on how do you know? Well, because the plant's still running. Yeah, but just because the plant's still running doesn't mean there's not an adversary down there. Like, do you have any monitoring? Do you even know what's in your network? Well, no. Well, how are you going to tell me that the adversary is not present if you don't even know what's there? So, long-winded word of saying, like, we're not really looking very well, and so we're not seeing a lot of things. If you don't look, you won't see. Very straightforward. So we as a community in the ICS community need to look a lot more. And lo and behold, as we look, we start finding things. And as we find things, then we start realizing that there's more risk there than we realized. And that can get to some genuinely interesting conversations. Why? Well, for one, our future is highly connected. If you go to a power plant today or a manufacturing site or a rail line or a port, you'll find that it's not air gapped, it's not disconnected completely, but it's decently segmented networks from the enterprise. There's always connectivity and there's always going to be routes in, but there's a lot of kind of checkpoints and it feels like you're nicely segmented off from the internet at least, and probably from the enterprise to some level. Feels like a nice little castle and moat kind of feel. But the reality is all these companies around the world are becoming more and more and more connected. Now, a big word they throw out is digital transformation. It all means the same thing. They're doing hyper connectivity to our physical assets around the world so that they can derive more value and resources out of them. If I can connect up a physical controller to the cloud, maybe I can optimize it, get more value out of it. Maybe instead of a 30-year life cycle, I get 35 years out of it, which is going to save me tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. Maybe I can use cloud resources to optimize the process to create better products, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in business. And if nothing else, at least I can open up to do remote workforce where people all around the world can be my employees instead of just the local town and infrastructure. So by and large, this idea of getting digitally transformed or hyper connected is very, very appealing, especially at an executive level at these companies. What that means, though, is a number of these networks, these industrial control system sites that have not had a lot of security put into them before outside of regulation and compliance, now they're getting connected up where they don't have the benefit of just being segmented. And because they're hyper connected, they're now accessible to those individuals and teams around the world that want to do them harm. And those teams and individuals that want to do them harm are learning about the uniqueness of industrial control systems and how to target them. So we have this convergence, not of IT and ICS converging, that's already happened. What we have as a convergence, though, is this digital transformation story, this hyperconnectivity thing happening at a time that our adversaries and our threats are learning more about ICS and becoming more interested in them. Those two things converging is forming risk in these environments like never before. And the reality is, when that converges, it's not comfortable. I mean, honestly, it can be quite scary. One of the reasons I want to do this entire presentation in comics is because we're going to talk about things like power outages and people trying to kill people. So let's put it in comics and try to have a little bit more of a levity conversation. It was a fun conversation with Sands, and they're like, "We want you to talk to teens about cyber attacks on infrastructure that can kill people." Oh, okay. Let's keep this light and festive. So the idea here is these things are happening. And the first ever cyber attack to take down electric power happened in Ukraine in 2015. I was one of the lead investigators on that attack. And what we saw was an adversary gained access to those sensitive industrial networks, learned the operations. It wasn't exploits and vulnerabilities and malware. That wasn't the focus. The focus was they learned how to use the native functionality in that environment. If an engineer or an operator can turn on the lights or turn off the lights, why couldn't an adversary? And so they learned how to control our control equipment just like an insider, but to do it remotely and with malicious intent. And so they ended up causing power outage in the middle of December for over 225,000 customers. One apartment building is a customer. So you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people that were scared in the middle of winter as their lights went out because a foreign adversary decided to do something about that. We saw it again in 2016. Again, there was a cyber attack in Ukraine that caused electric power outage. Lots of other attacks that really went undiagnosed against the mining industry and rail industry and healthcare industry. We also, in 2017, saw the first ever cyber attack explicitly targeted against human life. It was a petrochemical facility in Saudi Arabia, and an adversary explicitly targeted it, trying to kill people at that site. They made a simple error, because your adversaries are humans too, and that simple error caused the plant to go into an offline state. And so the company only lost tens of millions of dollars, but they're lucky because what the adversary was trying to do was kill 50 to 60 people at that site. So the topic of infrastructure security scares people, and rightfully so, but we want to, again, dial down the hype. Just because something can happen doesn't mean it can happen often and everywhere. And just because something can happen doesn't mean you can't get ahead of it. But at the same time, we need to appreciate that there's some pretty bad people in the world that want to do things well beyond whatever motivations we can understand. And we want to deny them the ability to do that. But at its core, realize that the offense and the defense, they got to do a lot of the same stuff. If you're going to be listening to a lot of our SANS pen testers today, and some of the folks that have gotten some fantastic careers being on kind of the mock offense, when you look at what they do, they've got to break into networks and learn the networks. They have to learn the environment and figure out what they can do in that environment before they actually achieve their goals. Your state adversary is the same thing. When you break into some other power plant, it's not like they're all built the same. You got to start mapping out what assets are there. How is this connected? Okay, well, if I push this button, what does that do? And are there any physical safeguards here that I won't see on the network? There's a lot of discovery and effort to be put into this. These are operations. It's not, I'm going to push a button and somebody dies. These are long, long operations that people run. And lo and behold, it's exactly the same type of stuff that defenders have to do. You should be getting into your networks and figuring out, well, what is here? What's worth protecting? What are these interesting industrial control systems that I have? Do I need to protect them differently than a normal enterprise system? How are things connected? Should that thing be beaconing out to the internet? Those are the questions you'll ask. Those are the questions the offensive asks. There's nothing magical about being on the offense. There's nothing magical about being on the defense outside of the fact that you get to be the good guys. There's very few things in life that are black and white. There's very few things that aren't drizzled with nuance and gray. But being the people that are protecting infrastructure and keeping the lights on versus the ones that are trying to turn it off, that's a very black and white thing. And it's a beautiful thing to get to be on the defense and actually go to bed at night feeling good about yourself instead of having to hate yourself for being a horrible human being targeting civilians. So what do you do? Well, If you're going to go post this presentation and try to do some security and industrial control systems. Now, again, on your journey, you're learning a lot of things, and a lot of people are talking at you very quickly today and lots of information. But when you get to the point that you join your collegiate program or you get into the workforce, remember to start with the basics, whether you're in industrial control systems or IT. You'll get hit up with all the latest of here's artificial intelligence, and here's this new neural network, and here's this amazing new thing, and next generation, this, that, and the other. But if you didn't do the basics, a lot of those cool advancements don't actually provide a lot of value. If you do the basics, a lot of those advancements can provide cool value, but you got to have a strong foundation, right? It's just like everything else in life. A strong foundation is going to get you to a place that you can do the cool things. But if you're not doing the strong foundation, then no matter what you do, you're going to just be a victim. And that's not a place we want to be. And ultimately, it's not just about technology. At the end of the day, of course, it's a team sport, and we all know that. And the reality, of course, is if you're working in industrial control systems, you need to go understand the engineers and the operators. I talked at the very beginning of the presentation about the need to understand the mission. Forget walking in and going, oh my gosh, it's a vulnerable system, we got to patch it. Hold on. What are we trying to accomplish here? What's the mission? What do we actually need to do for this organization? That's where you start. And a lot of that is not going to come in like, hey, I'm the cybersecurity person, I know what's best for the organization. No, a lot of that's going to come in by saying, hey, operations person, engineer, you've been here for 5, 10, 20, 30 years. I know you're not a security person, but what do you think is important here? What do you think is worth protecting? They're going to know a lot more about what's important and what the impact could be if it went bad. Then you'll be able to add in your expertise of, oh, well, I think that if that thing is really important over there, if that gas turbine generating electricity is really important over there, then the connection out to the vendor that's riding over the internet, maybe we want to put a firewall in between that so that not everybody else can access it too. Oh, okay, that makes sense. But you're going to have to learn the language of the business more than the language of cybersecurity. And if you're going into the world of industrial operations, never, ever, ever undervalue the ability to bring in a box of donuts and just have a conversation and say, hey, I'm here to learn. If you can sit down and watch the television show How It's Made or anything like it, and seeing the industrial world and seeing how Coca-Cola bottles and Mars makes confectionery and M&Ms, or the power company spins up a gas turbine to create electricity, if any of that stuff excites you, you're going to be at home in this field of industrial control systems. And with or without cybersecurity jargon, you're going to find a lot of people that want to talk to you and share their beautiful world. And it's, like I said, a beautiful thing, because at the end of the day, we can win. Okay. And that's the biggest thing to take away of this presentation is you're going to get beat up with a lot of cynicism in your lives. You know this, especially as teenagers. For those of you that are teenagers, you know firsthand quite a few folks out there who love to dwell on the cynicism of the world. But the optimism is there if we invest in ourselves. If we continue our education, we'll win. And it's not just in the latest technology. Those are cool. I work at a technology company. Technology is cool. But you'll never go wrong with investing in yourself and trying to learn. And it's not only in classes. I love my SANS classes, but that's not the only way to learn. The way to learn is, again, to ask questions and go talk to those folks that run those plants and get involved, and ultimately to not get stuck in the minutia. Especially in the world of industrial control systems, everybody has an opinion. I've sat on tons of panels across the world, sit in plenty of discussions and congressional hearings and similar, or I'll have somebody who's never stepped a foot in a power plant in their life tell me all the things that can happen in electric power. And it's like, that's not what's really happening. And you got to have the expertise to be able to push back, the kindness to know how to push back, the wherewithal to be able to educate instead of just countering. And again, the desire and the passion to go do this. Now, don't misconstrue that you need to have passion to be in industrial control systems. It can just be a job for you. Eventually, if you're really good at it, it might become a passion, but it's going to be hard. And the beautiful thing about industrial control systems to me is a lot of it is kind of wild, wild west. There's a lot of things that are decently well established in cybersecurity, and we're still growing and learning all the time. But we generally understand how enterprise security networks need to be protected, and then it's just really hard to go do it. There is always innovation, but it's just a lot of hard work too. And industrial control systems, it's a lot of figuring it out still. And there's a lot of new things to be come up with, things that we haven't thought about before because we haven't spent 20 or 30 years protecting these networks in the way that we have enterprise. And there's something kind of exciting about being that early explorer, getting in and being able to keep the lights on for people and making sure that your hometown is protected. Like that's a good feeling at the end of the day. And like I said earlier, it all comes down to the fact that defense is doable, especially in industrial control systems. You'll walk in and have somebody tell you, oh, that's a Windows XP system or a Windows 7 system in a power plant. Oh no, it's old. Okay, so big deal. It's old. Okay, it's still working. How can we protect it? Because again, optimism is never going to misguide you, especially in this field of industrial control systems. And what you'll find over and over and over again is our community, as you go participate in it, is going to have your back. In my short career, I've been highly successful, not because I am all that good at anything. I've been highly successful because I know when to shut up and ask questions. And we have an amazing community that will go out of their way to help you and to be there for you. And, again, a 30-minute presentation, the best thing I can convey to you is industrial control systems are everywhere. They're really, really cool and they're worth learning about. And our community is amazing. And yeah, there's a lot of stuff to do, a lot of enterprise security stuff, a lot of stuff you'll hear about these SANS presentations today, and they're all cool. But I'd be misleading you to tell you that I anything other than the fact that I'm extremely passionate about industrial control systems. I think you should go learn about them. The biggest takeaway, of course, in my entire presentation is to just avoid blockchain. And this is in no way tied to anything related to industrial control systems, and it's probably completely irrelevant for my presentation as a whole. But I, get hit up by blockchain people and crypto bros all the time enough that I just like including a slide to tell you that it's complete crap and you should just generally avoid all of it. But we could solve everything, but no, you can't. Just push back against that. Go learn the basics. Go ask your operators and engineers how to have fun in their communities, and ultimately you'll be successful. With that, I'm going to wrap up my presentation. I'm going to leave a couple minutes for a couple questions. And then, like I said, for any and every question that's in the chat, I'll go answer them. But the other thing that I'll include for you here is a link to a blog I wrote explicitly for getting started in ICS security, or ICS or SCADA security. And on this blog, more than I can convey in a 30-minute presentation, is a list of a ton of resources to be useful to you. And they're all free. Most of them in that link are free. And it's free videos and packet captures and tools and resources to just dive into the world of industrial control systems. And what I would tell you is, before you jump in thinking of the cybersecurity piece of it, first learn that physics piece. I don't mean go take physics classes, those are cool too, but I mean go learn the physical process first. How does a wastewater treatment facility work? How does a gas turbine work? How does a carbon cracker in an oil refinery work? Go learn the physical process first. Learn the language of the mission of that side of the house. Then think about the cybersecurity considerations around it. That is going to make you successful in this field. All right, so a couple questions for us. First, my favorite one, which is, what is blockchain? I will tell you that basically you are miles ahead of everybody just by not knowing it, and you should keep your mind that way. But in all seriousness, it's a technology that folks try to pitch as a silver bullet for most things, and it's not very useful. But generally what it actually is it's a ledger. It's a place to store information, or at least records of information. But the reason blockchain gets picked on a lot is because people pitch it for everything. And the reality is we've had secure ledgers since like the 80s. So there's nothing new there. Let's see. Comics were amazing. Thank you. That's awesome. Dragos, that's my company. We work in the ICS security community. What product does Rob use in his beard? This is all natural, but I do like a good oil every now and then. It's fantastic. Through the different routes of getting involved in cybersecurity, would you recommend going to college or studying certs before going to college? Good question. Here's my honest answer to you. I think that you do not need college or certifications to get started in this field. However, that is a very white male answer. if you are a minority or if you're a female in this field trying to get started, the honest answer is, unfortunately, there can be a lot of just crap that you have to deal with, and sometimes a certification or a college degree next to your name is what you need to help boost you ahead, and that's awful, and I'm sorry. But the honest answer is, for me to tell you you don't need certifications is very much my privilege showing as a white male that hasn't had to. But I have plenty of friends who are women or trans or non-binary or Black and so forth. And they've told me that their journeys are different. So your answer is going to be different for you based on your path. Generally speaking, though, I don't think college is or should be required. My employer, as an example, we don't require college degrees. But if it's something that's useful to you on your journey, you should do it. I know if I wouldn't have gone to college, that I don't know that I was of the maturity to be in an unstructured environment and learn. College was very useful for me for where I was at the time. For some people, it's not. And then let's see, last question. There's a bunch of good ones here. Actually, I'm not going to run over because the next speaker is awesome, and I want you to talk to them as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop my presentation. I'm going to answer every question, though. I'll type it out in the answer there. Lee, back over to you, and thanks everybody for your time today.